You know those stories that just really stick with you, the ones that feel like they get at something fundamental?
Hmm.
Well, George Orwell's 1984, that's definitely one of them.
Absolutely.
Even if maybe you haven't read it in ages, or ever, you probably know the terms. Newspeak, doublethink.
Unperson.
Yeah, exactly. They've kind of become our shorthand for societies that feel, well, a bit too controlled, you know?
It's amazing, isn't it? A novel from, what, the late 40s?
Yeah.
And it still gives us this really potent framework for looking at how power works, how it affects individuals, whole societies. And yeah, that's exactly what we're digging into today.
Right. But we're not just doing like another literary analysis. We've got this fantastic source.
Oh, yeah.
It's George Enteen's George Orwell and the Theory of Totalitarianism, a 1984 retrospective.
Okay.
And what makes Enteen's view so interesting is that he was a historian. He actually used 1984 teaching about communism, and he lived in the Soviet Union himself.
So he had both the academic and the firsthand experience. That's gold.
Exactly. It's a historian reflecting on fiction through his own work and his, personal encounters with the place Orwell seemed to be describing.
That's a really valuable lens.
So that's our mission today, really, to unpack what Enteen learned. We want to see how Orwell's Oceania stacks up against the real Soviet Union of the late 50s, early 60s, based on what Enteen saw.
And look at the bigger picture, too, right? What
Yeah.
it tells us about power, language, maybe even human nature itself.
You got it. Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start?
Well, I think we have to start with the tricky bit. Historians using novels.
Right, as sources.
Yeah, because as Enteen points out, literature isn't just a mirror. It's not that simple. You've got the author's intention, you've got archetypes, cultural stuff. It's complex. Art isn't just reflecting nature,
And Orwell himself, didn't he call 1984 a utopia in that original sense of no place?
Exactly. An other realm. And satire. He was clear it involved exaggeration.
So it's deliberately not meant to be a literal photo.
Right. Which poses the question, how do you pull historical insight from that? It's interesting. Enteen notes that some bits, like the Goldstein book excerpts,
Ah, yeah, the book within the book.
those bits read almost like historical analysis, like a summary or parody of Trotsky's ideas about Stalinism.
Right, exaggerating Trotsky's critiques into this whole counter-ideology for Oceania.
The lines get kind of blurry.
They really do. It almost begs you to read it as history, even though it isn't. And Enteen really stresses, the need for historians to be careful with that.
Yeah.
Methodologically careful.
Definitely. Which leads us nicely into Enteen's own story with the book.
His personal encounter.
Yeah. He talks about reading it first as a student, and it's quite funny, actually.
How so?
He basically read it expecting it to be, totally factual, a direct report.
Like reading the sports scores or something, expecting it to match reality exactly.
Pretty much. So when he actually went to the Soviet Union as an exchange student, this was 59-60,
Okay.
some of his first impressions did feel a bit Orwellian. The disorganization he saw, people sticking rigidly to rules, those sort of dank corridors.
That atmosphere.
Exactly. But then, pretty quickly, things didn't quite fit.
Oh.
He started noticing, normal stuff. Sidewalk cafes in Moscow, ice cream vendors, bootblacks.
Little details of everyday life.
Things Orwell hadn't put in the picture. And it surprised him.
It's like the setting felt familiar, but the people weren't quite playing the parts he expected.
Precisely. And then he tells this really striking story about a relative, an old Bolshevik aunt.
Someone from before the revolution.
Yeah. And even talking about a purges, she blamed it all on, German misinformation.
Oh.
Completely sticking to the party line.
Wow. That's commitment.
Incredible conviction, right? But what really got Enteen wasn't just that. It was how warm and genuinely interested she was in her American family.
Despite the politics.
Yeah. It flew in the face of the total alienation he might have expected. He felt this human connection.
That's powerful, not the absolute divide.
And it wasn't just her. He tells another story, seeing a policeman dealing with a drunk guy.
Okay.
The whole scene was apparently almost funny. The drunk arguing about where to go. And Enteen's thought was, where's Big Brother?
Huh. That little moment of unexpected, almost mundane normalcy.
Exactly. Even humor. Things 1984 hadn't quite prepared him for.
We need to remember the context, too, right? Soviet Union, 1959-60.
Crucial point. Enteen stresses this wasn't Stalin's peak terror anymore. There had been economic progress after 52. De-Stalinization was happening.
The Khrushchev thaw era.
Right. There was this sense of hope, maybe for more legality, better living standards. The big political camps were mostly empty. The intense fear had dialed back a lot.
So not the constant grinding oppression of 1984's Oceania.
Not entirely. Enteen talks about finding this seam of life Orwell hadn't shown him.
What did that look like?
Things like curiosity, intellectual energy among students, actual hope, solidarity. He was amazed how much Soviet students knew about American pop culture, even with limited information.
That resilience again. People finding ways to connect, to learn.
Yeah. And he also saw this big gap with the official historians he met.
Oh, so?
Their published writing was, tedious, flat, replete with falsification, as he put it.
Standard official stuff.
But in person. They were often smart, proud, even argumentative. Much more complex than the official image.
That gap must have been fascinating for him as a historian.
It really shaped his scholarship, that difference between the official story and lived reality.
Okay, so Enteen saw differences, but what about Orwell's accuracy? Did he get things right?
Oh, Enteen definitely gives Orwell credit. He says Orwell was incredibly perceptive, even prophetic in many ways.
Like what?
Well, he even suggests maybe understanding Julia's character better might have prepared him more for some things he saw.
Interesting. What about the darker stuff? The control?
He absolutely confirms the informer system. That was real and pervasive.
The least pleasant aspect, he called it.
Exactly. He saw it in the dorms, in Leningrad society. He noticed how Jewish people from the Baltics, some Ukrainians, were much more cautious around foreigners.
Understandable. The fear of being watched, reported.
Yeah, real suspicion. He even mentions foreign students sometimes having to kind of shield their Russian friends, who were maybe a bit too open.
Wow. So that core element of surveillance and mistrust in Oceania, that resonated.
Deeply. He also says Orwell nailed the sort of squalor and dinginess of ordinary life, though maybe poverty wasn't quite as absolute everywhere as the book suggests.
Okay. What about censorship and propaganda? Did that work like in the book?
Enteen had two thoughts on this. First, he thought maybe the censorship wasn't that effective, that people saw through it more than you'd think.
That matches some of his other observations?
But then his second, more considered view was that the constant drip, drip, drip of, bland, one-sided information did have an effect. He called it a coarsening of mind. Not necessarily making people believe outright lies all the time, but just dulling critical thinking through this limited, biased flow of information.
That's a really subtle but important point, the cumulative effect.
Yeah. And he also noted how the authorities started shifting. Less purely socialist symbols, more tapping into national symbols, nationalism, to get people on board.
A tactic we still see everywhere, unfortunately.
Very universal.
Yeah.
Now, Julia's rebellion, Enteen has a really interesting take here.
Okay, Winston's lover. How did he see her?
He pushes back against seeing her rebellion as just like biological impulse or hedonism.
Just wanting pleasure.
Right. He argues she was actually quite shrewd. Her attitude was basically, look, we all know this party stuff is rubbish, so why stress about it?
Pragmatic cynicism.
Kind of. And she just assumed most people felt the same way secretly and would break the rules if they thought they could get away with it.
So not an intellectual rebel like Winston, but still rejecting the ideology in her own way.
Exactly. And Enteen thinks Julia represents a whole spectrum of responses you actually found in the Soviet Union, not just total belief or total opposition.
That makes sense. The shades of gray.
But where Enteen finds Orwell fundamentally spot on is how the system warped the whole idea of being a citizen.
How do you mean?
There was just no real public space, no way for individuals to genuinely discuss society's direction or argue for what's just. You weren't really a citizen with rights, but you weren't just a passive subject either, because the party was always mobilizing you.
Constantly involved, but with no real agency.
Precisely. He uses the example of Valery Chaladze, the dissident.
Right, you mentioned him.
Having his passport taken away in a New York hotel lobby, all done with this facade of legal process. It just shows the arbitrary power beneath the surface, utter lack of real freedom.
Chilling. Okay, what about those famous concepts? Unperson, memory hole.
Yeah. Enteen acknowledges they're totally part of our vocabulary now.
For sure.
But again, he suggests Orwell kind of exaggerated and simplified how controlling the past actually worked.
So it wasn't quite as seamless or total as in the book?
Apparently not. Enteen found that historians and even the public sense of the past wasn't quite as twisted as 1984 led him to expect.
But that doesn't mean the party failed, right?
Not at all. He stresses that controlling history is hard work. It takes policy, overcoming obstacles. And he says the party's dominance over the historical profession was, in its own grim way, an impressive administrative accomplishment.
So they were effective, even if not omnipotent, like Big Brother.
Right. And the result, a real loss of the past for people. Enteen talks about Russians and others losing touch with their own history, even basic things like traditional food.
Creating a kind of vacuum.
Exactly. A hunger for meaning, for continuity, which unfortunately makes people more vulnerable to manipulation through things like nationalist slogans.
Or swinging between extremes regarding the outside world, like fearing foreigners or fawning over them.
Yeah, though he notes that it can be put on or outgrown sometimes.
It's a complex picture. How did Orwell manage such insight, writing from afar? What gave his vision such power?
Enteen connects it back to Orwell's own life. His sort of unstable social position, feeling like an outsider.
His time in Burma, fighting in Spain.
Right. That mix of self-doubt and fierce integrity. And crucially, his absolute dedication to the English language, something he honed from his time at Eton.
The famous essay, Politics in the English Language.
Exactly. Orwell deeply believed that sloppy language enables sloppy thought, that political decay and language decay go hand in hand.
He saw himself like Swift, right,
Yeah.
having that terrible intensity of vision.
Yeah, able to magnify hidden truths. And Newspeak, that's central to 1984, isn't it?
The ultimate tool of control, language designed to make thought crime impossible.
The ultimate instrument. Though it's interesting, George Steiner had a slightly different take. Steiner argued linguistic decay often happens through, like, verbal inflation, using euphemisms, jargon, not necessarily fewer words.
Like pacification for bombing or extreme prejudice for assassination.
Exactly. Those sanitized terms that hide reality.
Two sides of the same coin, maybe? Manipulating language either way.
Could be. But Enteen gives Orwell huge credit for just alerting us to the danger. The fact we even have the word Orwellian probably helps fight against that kind of abuse.
Good point. And Newspeak, it connects directly to Stalin's terror, doesn't it? The idea of stopping people thinking.
Enteen says many Russians felt Stalin was literally trying to stop them thinking independently. Orwell's line, orthodoxy means not thinking.
Not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness.
Chilling stuff. And it echoes Trotsky saying the party is always right. It's the only historical instrument.
So dissent isn't just wrong, it's historically impossible in that view.
Pretty much. Enteen also quotes some incredibly early warnings from within the Soviet system itself.
Like who?
V.V. Yasinski, back in 1920, warning that total militarization would destroy civil rights, turn citizens into just cogs in the machine.
Wow, 1920.
And Grigory Pyatakov, talking about the Communist Party demanding complete surrender of individual thought, like a religion.
That level of demanded conformity is hard to grasp.
And Stalin himself, believing he and the party had this duty to plot the entire future, and only he was fit to be political. Everyone else just follows.
Okay, so Orwell captured that totalitarian mindset incredibly well. Do these ideas stretch beyond just those regimes?
Enteen thinks so, briefly. He touches on how Orwell's critiques resonate today. Think about bureaucratized societies, consumerism, technology.
Surveillance, media manipulation.
All of it. The growth of specialized institutions controlling parts of our lives. There are echoes.
Definitely food for thought. But going back to 1984 itself, Enteen sees this fundamental split in Orwell's view of humanity.
They split. How so?
Like two contrasting images. On one hand, the free, spontaneous individual may be connected to nature.
The ideal.
Kind of, echoing Rousseau, maybe ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Celebrating emotions, intuition, not just reason, like Winston trying to feel things.
And sex plays a big role there, doesn't it?
Huge. Orwell presents it as renewal, liberation, a fundamentally human thing that the party wants to crush. A conspiracy against Big Brother.
The plan to abolish the orgasm.
Exactly. Passion is the basis for family, community, all the things that make us human. And memory, history too, that's vital for identity.
Like Winston writing the diary, reclaiming a past.
Right. So there's this side celebrating nature, passion, memory, maybe even tradition in a way.
Okay, that's the bright side, as Enteen puts it. What's the other side?
The dark side. The enslaved, broken, immoral, irrational human, the soulless automaton.
Like Hannah Arendt's living corpses.
Precisely, or Eric Fromm's idea. And this is what O'Brien wants to turn Winston into, that truly terrifying description of the future.
Where there's no love, no loyalty, no curiosity.
Just power.
A world where conscience means nothing, individuality is gone. And Winston betraying Julia, That's him becoming that living corpse.
With transformation.
Which leads to that incredibly ambiguous, chilling ending.
The tears, feeling everything was all right.
You love Big Brother.
Ugh.
It just hits you.
And it leaves you with that massive question Enteen raises. Can people really be broke in it? Completely.
Yeah.
Made to love their tormentor.
Does history actually back that up? Well, Enteen offers some powerful counter-evidence, thankfully.
Like what?
He points to Bruno Bettelheim's work on Nazi camps. Bettelheim found that keeping some sense of conscience, even making small sacrifices for others, was crucial for survival, for staying human. And then the memoirs from the Soviet Gulag, Evgeny Ginsberg, Solzhenitsyn.
Yes.
They write powerfully about love surviving, about friendship, and crucially, about the enduring ability to hate your tormentors. That doesn't seem to die easily.
So maybe breaking the human spirit, stopping thought completely, maybe that's harder than O'Brien or Stalin imagined.
That seems to be Enteen's final thought, that it might be more difficult to stop people from thinking than these regimes believed.
Which is, in a dark way, hopeful.
It is. Ultimately, this whole look back through Enteen's eyes just shows how complex and enduring 1984 really is.
Absolutely. It's not just a simple allegory. We've really explored that gap, haven't we? Between Orwell's vision and the messier reality Enteen saw in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, especially that resilience, human connection, thought, finding ways to survive even under pressure.
So maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. How do power structures today, maybe in more subtle ways, try to shape our reality, our understanding?
And how important is it to keep questioning, thinking critically, and holding on to those human connections Enteen saw persisting?
Right. And maybe ponder that ending again, that victory over oneself that Winston achieves. Is that really a victory?
Or is it the most profound defeat imaginable?